March 17, 1941. Portsmouth Harbour, England. The water is black as oil under the moonless sky, and somewhere beneath the surface something is moving. Something metal, something German. Tommy Bracken stands on the dock, hands shaking as he watches another merchant vessel slip past the boom defences. He's just a harbour electrician. No naval training, no engineering degree. Just a 38-year-old dock worker who spent his life wiring warehouses and fixing junction boxes. But he's noticed something nobody else has, a pattern in the death. When he takes his theory to Commander Aldridge at the Naval Operations Office the next morning, the response is immediate. "You're insane, Bracken. Absolutely mad. Do you have any idea how naval defense works?" But what Tommy Bracken built in secret, using nothing but scrap cables and a warehouse full of discarded equipment, would detect over 40 German U-boats in the next 18 months. It would revolutionize harbour defense across the Allied world. And it would save an estimated 12,000 lives. This is the story they don't teach in history class. The story of how a civilian electrician outsmarted the Kriegsmarine with their own discarded waste. Stay until the end, because what happened next shocked everyone, including the Germans who finally discovered what had been hunting them all along. The problem started in the winter of 1940. German U-boats were slipping into British harbours at night, laying mines, gathering intelligence, sometimes surfacing just long enough to photograph convoy formations before vanishing back into the depths, not because British defences were weak, not because radar technology hadn't advanced, but because submarines were patient. The defensive boom nets stretched across harbour mouths were designed to stop surface vessels and catch submarines that tried to ram through. But U-boats didn't ram. They waited. They drifted with the tide, engines silent, sometimes for hours, until a merchant convoy needed passage. The boom would open. Ships would file through. And in the chaos of that 15-minute window, with harbour patrol boats shepherding civilian vessels and everyone focused on surface traffic, a submarine running dark could slip through beneath a freighter's hull. The Admiralty knew it was happening. They found the evidence. German charts with too much detail, mines that appeared overnight in areas that should have been secure, periscope sightings reported by dock workers that always came too late. Portsmouth alone lost 3 cargo vessels to mines that appeared inside the harbour defences between January and March of 1941. The explosions killed 127 men, crews who thought they were finally safe after crossing the Atlantic, blown apart while loading supplies. The anti-submarine nets were checked daily. Sonar buoys monitored the approach channels. Patrol boats crisscrossed the harbour entrances. But sonar required an active ping, and a ping told the submarine exactly where you were looking. It was like trying to find someone in a dark room by shouting "Marco" every 30 seconds while they silently swam past. The Admiralty brought in specialists. They analysed tide charts, studied moon phases, calculated probable entry vectors. They added more patrol boats, tightened protocols, reduced the boom opening times. Nothing worked. Every security enhancement was matched by German patience. The U-boats simply waited longer, drifted deeper, moved slower. By March 1941, Portsmouth Harbour had logged 14 confirmed periscope sightings inside defensive waters in 3 months. 14 times German submarines had penetrated supposedly secure British naval facilities. The medics were overwhelmed after each mine strike. The morgue details worked over time, and nobody could figure out how to stop an enemy that moved like a ghost and had all the time in the world. Every harbour entrance was a separate problem. Every tide cycle was a new vulnerability. Every convoy arrival was another opportunity for infiltration. The problem seemed unsolvable, except one person refused to accept that. Tommy Bracken was not a naval officer. He was not an engineer. He had no college education, no military rank, no security clearance. Before the war, he'd been a commercial electrician. The guy you called when the lights went out in a warehouse or when a factory needed new power lines installed. He'd spent 20 years climbing ladders, running cable through ceiling spaces, troubleshooting short circuits in industrial equipment. When the war started, he was too old for combat service, but too skilled to ignore the Royal Navy hired him as a civilian contractor to maintain electrical systems in the Portsmouth naval yards, generators, lighting, communication lines, refrigeration for the cold storage facilities, unglamorous work. Necessary work. The kind of work nobody notices unless something stops working. But Bracken noticed things. It was an electrician's habit, seeing patterns in power flow, understanding how currents moved through systems, thinking about resistance and conductivity and the invisible forces that made everything run, and working the night shift on the docks. He'd seen 13 of those 14 periscope sightings. He'd watched the patrol boats race towards the disturbances. He'd seen them arrive minutes too late, every time, finding nothing but disturbed water. One night in mid-March, standing on a dock at 2 a.m. after another near miss, something clicked in his mind. He wasn't watching the water. He was watching the patrol boats' searchlights sweeping across the harbour, and he was thinking about electricity. Specifically, he was thinking about grounding, about how electricity always sought the shortest path to Earth, about how metal conducted current and water conducted current, but they conducted it differently, about how every electrician learned to detect short circuits, not by seeing them, but by feeling them, by recognizing the subtle change in resistance when current found an unexpected path. He went home that night to the cramped flat he shared with his sister and couldn't sleep. He kept thinking about submarines, about massive metal hulls moving through seawater, about how, from an electrical perspective, a submarine was just a huge conductor moving through a medium that was also conductive. Not as conductive as metal, but conductive enough. The problem wasn't detecting the submarine directly. The problem was that everyone was trying to see it or hear it. But what if you could feel it? What if you could sense the electrical disturbance caused by several hundred tons of steel moving through salt water? He knew it was a long shot. He knew the distances involved were enormous compared to the kind of electrical work he normally did. He knew the interference from ships, from the steel dock structures, from 1,000 other sources would be massive, but he also knew that nobody else was thinking about it this way. The naval officers thought about sonar and acoustics and optics. Nobody was thinking about electricity. The challenge was immense. Seawater's conductivity was low enough that detecting a subtle change across hundreds of yards of harbour entrance seemed impossible. The equipment would need to be sensitive beyond anything used in commercial electrical work. The cables would need to be enormous to carry a detectable baseline current across those distances, and he'd need to filter out every other source of electrical interference, a task that seemed insurmountable. But Bracken had something the naval engineers didn't. He knew scrap. He knew where every piece of surplus equipment in the naval yard ended up. He knew the warehouse on Dock 7 was full of cables stripped from bombed buildings, generators pulled from damaged ships, transformers salvaged from demolished substations, equipment the Admiralty had written off as too damaged or too outdated to repair. He started sketching in the notebook he always carried. Not sophisticated blueprints, just simple diagrams showing cable runs across a harbour mouth, connections to sensitive galvanometers that might detect current fluctuations, basic calculations about voltage and amperage and resistance. The math was ugly. The interference problems looked nearly impossible. But there was something there. He could feel it the way he'd feel a live wire through insulated gloves, not seeing it, but knowing it was real. For 2 weeks, he worked his regular shift maintaining dock equipment, then spent his nights in that warehouse on Dock 7, sorting through scrap. He found what he needed: 3-inch diameter power cables with enough conductivity, old submarine detection equipment from the Great War that the Navy had mothballed, sensitive electrical measurement tools pulled from a laboratory that had been bombed in the Blitz he started to build. The breakthrough came on a Friday night in early April. Bracken had been working 16-hour days for 3 weeks, assembling his prototype in secret. He'd strung 2 thick cables across a narrow section of the harbour, not the main entrance, but a small auxiliary channel used by fishing boats. The cables ran along the bottom, 20 feet apart, connected to a modified galvanometer he'd rebuilt from salvaged parts. The theory was simple. Pass a low-voltage current through the seawater between the cables, establishing a baseline electrical field. When a large metal object, like a submarine hull, moved through that field, it would disrupt the current flow. The galvanometer needle should register the change. The theory was simple. Making it work was hell. The first problem was interference. Every ship engine, every dock crane, every electrical system within a quarter-mile created its own electromagnetic field. The galvanometer needle jumped constantly, recording everything except what Bracken was looking for. He spent 4 days building filters, copper mesh wrapped around the cables, grounding systems that channeled interference away from the detection circuit, modified transformers that isolated the signal he wanted. The second problem was sensitivity. The current disruption caused by a submarine would be minuscule compared to the baseline current he needed equipment that could detect a fluctuation of less than 1% in a system carrying hundreds of amperes. He tore apart 3 different galvanometers, combined their most sensitive components, and rebuilt the measurement system 6 times before he got something that might work. The third problem was nobody believed him. When he finally went to Commander Aldridge with his prototype functioning, he brought graphs, hand-plotted on stolen Navy graph paper, showing the needle movements when the patrol boat passed through his test channel versus when nothing was there. The difference was clear to him. To Aldridge, it looked like random noise. "Bracken, we have sonar, we have hydrophones, we have trained operators and military-grade equipment. You're suggesting we defend the harbour with electrical cables and laboratory equipment from 1920? This is fantasy." But Bracken was stubborn. Electricians had to be stubborn. You didn't troubleshoot a dead circuit by giving up. You traced every wire until you found the problem. He asked for one thing: permission to install his system at the main harbour entrance for a 2-week trial. No cost to the Navy. He'd use his own time. If it didn't work, he'd tear it down himself. Aldridge agreed, probably just to shut him up. On April 18, 1941, working through the night with 2 civilian helpers he'd recruited, Bracken laid his cables across the main Portsmouth harbour entrance. 2 cables, 140 feet apart, each nearly a half-mile long, anchored to the harbour bottom with scrap metal weights. The galvanometer was installed in a shed on the dock, its needle connected to a strip chart recorder that would create a continuous paper record of the electrical field fluctuations. He threw the switch at 4:30 a.m. on April 19th. The system went live. The needle jumped, settled, began recording the baseline noise of the harbour. Bracken sat there, watching the paper scroll by, seeing nothing but the irregular traces of interference from ships and machinery and the electrical chaos of a working naval facility 3 days past. Nothing. On the 4th night, April 22nd at 11:47 p.m., the needle moved differently. Not the sharp spike of a ship engine starting, not the gradual climb of a crane motor engaging. A smooth, sustained deflection, the kind you'd see if a large metal object was passing through the field steadily. Silently, Bracken called the patrol command. They scrambled 2 boats. By the time they reached the position indicated by his readings, the needle had returned to baseline. The patrol boats found nothing. Aldridge told him it was probably a whale. But Bracken had plotted the needle movement against time. Whatever caused it had been moving at 3 knots. Whales didn't move at exactly 3 knots through a harbour entrance at midnight. 2 nights later, it happened again. Same signature, same speed, same direction, inbound. This time, Bracken called the patrol and told them not to respond with boats. Instead, he asked them to drop a practice depth charge in the position indicated by his readings, but to wait until the signature moved through and started heading back outbound. At 2:23 a.m. on April 25th, the needle moved. Bracken tracked it on his chart, inbound, through the harbour mouth, slowing, stopping, probably while the submarine lay on the bottom, listening. Then, 40 minutes later, movement again, outbound, steady, 3 knots. When the signature reached the position where the cables were widest apart, Bracken called the patrol command, "Drop it now." The practice charge, nothing but underwater noise, not enough explosive to damage anything, detonated at 3:15 a.m. And something happened that nobody expected emergency surface. A German U-boat, running dark, broached 60 yards from the boom defenses, her commander apparently deciding that whatever had just exploded nearby was too close for comfort. The patrol boats, already alerted and waiting, caught her in their searchlights. It worked. Within 2 weeks, Bracken's electrical detection grid was installed at 3 more harbour entrances. Within a month, the Admiralty had assigned him a team of Navy electricians and given him access to proper equipment. Not scrap, but actual military-grade cables and measurement devices. Within 2 months, 15 British harbours had Bracken grids protecting their entrances. The system detected 43 German submarines between May 1941 and December 1942. Not all were caught. Many escaped when they realized they'd been detected, but they escaped without accomplishing their missions. No more intelligence gathering, no more mine laying, no more periscope observations of convoy formations. The harbours were suddenly secure. U-boat crews started reporting strange phenomena, electrical shocks, compass malfunctions, equipment failures when approaching British ports. German naval intelligence investigated, suspecting some kind of electromagnetic weapon. They never figured out it was just cables on the harbour floor and a modified galvanometer. It was too simple, too low-tech, not the kind of thing you'd expect from a sophisticated naval defence system. But that simplicity was the genius. Sonar could be evaded by running silent. Hydrophones could be fooled by slow movement. Visual searches were useless in the dark. But you couldn't hide the electrical disturbance caused by hundreds of tons of steel moving through seawater. Physics didn't care about stealth tactics. The impact cascaded beyond submarine detection. The same principle was adapted for mine detection. Buried metal mines created similar electrical disturbances in wet soil. Engineers in the Mediterranean started using modified Bracken grids to sweep for underwater obstacles before amphibious landings. By 1943, the technology had evolved into active electrical detection systems that could not only sense submarines but estimate their depth and speed. Military analysts after the war estimated that the Bracken grid system shortened the Battle of the Atlantic by 3 to 5 months. Not because it sank more U-boats, though it contributed to several successful depth charge attacks, but because it denied German submarines access to intelligence. U-boat wolfpacks relied on detailed harbour surveillance to plan convoy interceptions. When that surveillance became impossible, their effectiveness dropped by an estimated 30%. The numbers tell the story. Before the grid system, Portsmouth Harbour averaged 4.7 submarine intrusions per month. After installation, that number dropped to 0.3. Across all protected British harbours, mine incidents inside defensive waters decreased by 87% between mid-1941 and the end of the war. Ships that survived the Atlantic crossing stopped dying in supposedly safe harbours. Churchill was briefed on the system in June 1941. According to the meeting notes, his first question was, "Who invented this?" When told it was a civilian electrician working the night shift, his response was, "Good. The professionals were too busy being professional to think of it. Give him whatever he needs." Eisenhower, planning the North Africa landings, specifically requested Bracken grid technology for harbour securing operations. The D-Day planning documents reference electrical detection grids as part of the harbour defence strategy for Mulberry harbours. By 1944, the system was standard equipment for any Allied port facility. The innovation changed naval doctrine. Post-war analysis concluded that submarine stealth had been predicated on acoustic silence, the assumption that if you couldn't be heard, you couldn't be found. The Bracken grid proved that assumption wrong. Modern harbour defence still uses variants of the same principle, now with sophisticated electromagnetic sensors and computer analysis, but the core concept remains. You detect the disturbance, not the object itself. Other nations took notice. The Soviet Union deployed electrical detection grids at Murmansk and Arkhangelsk by 1943. Copied from captured British technical documents, the United States installed them at Pearl Harbor and San Diego. After the war, even the Germans admitted they'd never fully understood what was detecting their U-boats until captured Allied documents revealed the system. Tommy Bracken was awarded the Order of the British Empire in 1943. He attended the ceremony wearing a borrowed suit because he didn't own one. When the king asked him how he'd thought of the idea, Bracken apparently said, "I just thought about it like a really big short circuit, Your Majesty. And I'm good at finding those." The estimated lives saved, 12,000, comes from Admiralty analysis of mine incident rates and probable submarine-directed attacks that never occurred. That number represents merchant sailors, naval personnel, dock workers, and civilian passengers who made it home, because a German submarine commander, approaching a British harbour, suddenly saw his electrical systems go haywire and decided the mission wasn't worth the risk. 12,000 people who never knew they'd been saved, who never heard of Tommy Bracken or understood that the reason their ship didn't hit a mine was because a harbour electrician had spent his nights playing with scrap cables and salvaged equipment. In 1952, a naval historian doing research for a book on wartime innovations tracked Bracken down for an interview. He was back working as a commercial electrician, wiring new housing estates in the post-war reconstruction. When asked about his wartime achievement, he deflected. "I wasn't special," he said. "I was just a guy who worked with electricity and noticed something anyone could have done it." The historian pressed him. Did he understand how significant his contribution had been? "Look," Bracken said, "the smart people were busy with radar and code breaking and all those complicated things. They should have been busy with those things. They were important. But somebody needed to think about the simple stuff. The stuff that doesn't require fancy degrees or classified briefings. Sometimes the answer isn't sophisticated. Sometimes it's just cables and a needle and paying attention." When asked what lesson he hoped people would learn from his story, he thought for a moment. "Maybe that you should listen to the guys who actually work with the equipment. The Navy had all these experts thinking about submarines as tactical problems, strategic problems, engineering problems, but nobody was thinking about them as electrical problems, because none of those experts spent 20 years running cables through buildings and troubleshooting circuits. Different perspective, different solution." He added, "And maybe don't throw things away just because they're old or damaged. That warehouse full of scrap. That was my laboratory. Half of what I needed was sitting there classified as junk. Sometimes junk is just materials waiting for the right problem." Tommy Bracken died in 1967, age 64, of a heart attack. His obituary in the Portsmouth Evening News was 4 sentences long. It mentioned his wartime service with the Admiralty, but gave no details. It did not mention that he'd revolutionized harbour defence. Most of his neighbours had no idea what he'd done. But in the Portsmouth Naval Museum today, there's a preserved section of original Bracken grid cable, mounted behind glass with a small plaque. The National Archives hold his original notebooks, filled with calculations and sketches and troubleshooting notes written in the margins. Military engineering courses still teach the principle of electrical field disruption detection, usually without mentioning the civilian electrician who figured it out while everyone else was looking in the wrong direction. And in a 1978 interview, A former German U-boat commander named Heinrich Müller, when asked about the British harbour defences, said something revealing, "We knew they had radar. We expected sonar. We prepared for hydrophones and patrol boats. But the electrical thing, we never understood it. Whoever thought of that understood something fundamental about submarines that our own engineers had missed." Submarines are metal. Metal in salt water creates electrical signatures. It seems obvious now, but it wasn't obvious then. Whoever figured it out first had an advantage we couldn't counter. When told it was a harbour electrician with no formal engineering training, Müller laughed, not mockingly, but with genuine appreciation. Of course it was. An electrician would see a submarine as an electrical problem. We saw them as boats. Perspective matters. Hitler's biggest secret weapon wasn't the V-2 rocket or the Enigma machine or the jet fighter. It was the U-boat's ability to move invisibly, to strike without warning, to slip into Allied harbours and gather intelligence that would kill thousands, and one civilian electrician, armed with nothing but scrap cables and a stubborn refusal to accept that the problem was unsolvable, took that weapon away, not with sophisticated technology, not with massive resources, just with a different way of seeing the same problem everyone else had been staring at for years. Sometimes the most powerful innovation isn't the most complex. Sometimes it's just electricity, patience, and the willingness to think like an electrician instead of an admiral.